Okay, welcome to Note 6.2 for U.S. History class. We're going to talk about Reagan in these notes. So we're going to look at our next sets of notes through the four presidents we still have to finish: Reagan, Bush, Clinton, and Bush. The second Bush, we're only going to look at the first year of his presidency. But these ones, we're going to focus on Reagan and what happened in his two terms from 1980 to 1988. So here you see Reagan, the 40th president of the United States. If you notice, it says 81 to 89. 80 to 88, that's from the year he was elected to the next election. He was actually in office from 81 to 89. And that's why the years you can kind of go either way and be acceptable. So he was the 40th president, and one of the big things that Reagan is tied to is conservatism. He was very strict, staunch conservative, and in fact we really call it Reagan conservatism for some pieces of conservative. So some conservatives, there are some different sectors, and one is actually based off of Reagan and his beliefs and ideas. So essentially a definition for conservatism. So here we have our definition. The belief that government power, particularly in regard to the economy, should be limited in order to maximize individual freedom. So limited government power, more power at the state and local levels versus the national government. So that's your general definition for conservative. Now, in the 1980s, you actually had a couple other groups that came up. This group known as the moral conservatives, or sometimes referred to as the religious right. And the term moral majority was actually coined by Jerry Falwell. And this really placed a religious, moral emphasis on the conservative side, that you also socially had to have a conscience, but be concerned about moral religious pieces. And when we talk about religious, we're really talking about the Christian religion. And a lot of these people, so the people that we saw here, Falwell, Robertson, Jim and Tammy Faye Baker, they were televangelists, so really gospel TV, Thunder on the Right, the growth of fundamentalism, gospel TV, religion, politics, and money over here. So this was huge. Here you see a televangelist. That's actually not any of the ones I talked about. They would pack these huge arenas. And Jim and Tammy Faye Baker, you have to see them because look at Tammy Faye. Her hair, her makeup, you just got to look at Tammy Faye, right? And they actually, Jim and Tammy Faye Baker, actually did end up in jail for tax evasion. Had nothing to do with religion. But we see these different pieces. We see this rise of religion in politics during the 80s under Reagan's administration. So what were some of the policies that happened under Reagan? Well, domestically, we had deregulation. This is actually going to change a lot of what we see in business. So regulation is rules for business. So they make rules, they make guidelines, and businesses have to follow them. Well, in the 80s, we start to deregulate airlines, savings and loan, trucking and rail passengers, natural gas wells, cable communications. So you start to see all this deregulation. It did not always work, as we notice here. Cable TV was re-regulated. So deregulation puts fewer rules on companies. So companies have more flexibility. What that meant was companies could make more money. They did not necessarily share the money with the people who were working for them. So the idea was that companies would make more money, so it would be beneficial to people. So here we kind of have the cartoon that shows that. And beneficial to people because that money would go with this idea called supply-side economics, Reaganomics, or sometimes called trickle-down economics. The idea that the wealthiest top, the businesses, would get the money, and here he is kind of showing the idea, and so by having money, because of this deregulation, fewer taxes, the money would then end up going down to everyone else, all the workers, because they were making more money, they would pay the workers more. So that was really the idea of this. Ultimately, it did not work, and so we see that during the time period. So the plan didn't really work. Businesses became richer, individuals did not, or at least working individuals. So we see more divide between that top class and our middle class. So that was domestic. Foreign policies, détente or not to détente? Reagan actually ends détente. So when we ask the question of détente or not to détente, the answer would be not. He stops those eased tensions. In fact, Reagan starts a program known as Star Wars. That's the slang term for it. The official name of Star Wars was SDI, or Strategic Defense Initiative. And the idea of this, it really comes from the movie Star Wars. If you look at this picture here, there are video games based off of it. The idea is that we would use missiles and satellites to control these missiles, and we could launch from the US to Russia. If Russia launched something at us, we could stop it because we'd be able to, because our satellites would pick it up, we could stop it. So this whole new technology, using outer space, using these pieces to help keep us safe. That was the idea behind Star Wars, or Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI. So Reagan's really using some of this new technology that we had happening and applying it to military actions to the Cold War. This is not going to ease tensions with the Soviet Union. In fact, it increases some of the tensions because we're putting more money into our military again. And even when we were approached by the Soviet Union asking if we would stop this SDI plan, and they would get rid of some of their nuclear weapons, Reagan actually told Gorbachev, the leader of the Soviet Union at the time, no, he wouldn't do that. Now, by the end of Reagan's presidency, the Soviet Union starts to fall, but we actually see an end of détente in the 80s, and then in 89, an end to the Cold War. As the Cold War starts to end, we see an increase of tensions in the Middle East, some because of communism, some not. In Afghanistan, the Soviet-Afghan War, we actually back the Afghanis and arm them against the Soviets who are invading. So if we look at this next piece here, this is the Soviet-Afghan War, this upper one. You can see the Soviets invaded. So Soviets invading, so here's the Soviet Union. They invaded into Afghanistan. And the U.S. then sent support to stop the Soviets. So the Soviets were attempting to expand their territory. The U.S. did not want that, so we helped the Afghanis against the Soviets. So that's the Soviet-Afghan War. In the Iran-Iraq War, which happened as well, we also back basically against our enemy. So the idea in the Soviet-Afghan War was we were backing the group that was not our enemy. We were enemies with the Soviets, we backed the Afghans. Iran-Iraq, as you know, we're enemies with Iran, which meant we backed Iraq. So if we go back to this, you see here this bottom one is the Iran-Iraq War. And you see the two of them were fighting over these disputed areas, these two areas here. The U.S. sent weapons to support Iraq against Iran because we had so many issues with Iran. Think Iran hostage crisis, the embassy, those things, the Shah, the Ayatollah, all of those issues. So we were backing Iraq, and the person we were giving weapons to was Saddam Hussein, who later turned around to be a problem for us. But in the 80s, we were actually on his side because he was fighting against Iran and that fundamentalist government that we had issues with that had taken our people hostage. The next piece we see is called the Iran-Contra scandal. This is kind of confusing, so you have to actually pay attention here. So in the Iran-Contra scandal, or the Iran-Contra affair, it actually lasted from 83 to 88. Basically, what had happened were the Contras in Nicaragua, Reagan and his administration wanted to support them against the communists. The U.S. government, Congress said, no, we're not going to send money to them. We're not going to help them. So he had no budget money to send there. So what they ended up doing and facilitating, using this guy, Oliver North, he's also this guy right here, he's the one who took the blame for everything, was because he was facilitating, he was in the military. They actually traded weapons to Iran in exchange for hostages and money. And then they sent the money that they got for the weapons to Nicaragua. So the money never touched Congress, so it was never part of our budget. So it was a secret dealing. So basically they decided Reagan didn't actually know what was happening, but it really tainted the rest of his presidency after that. So his second term was really tainted by this whole scandal. And did Reagan know? Did Reagan not know? Did he let this happen? And he did know they were trading the arms for hostages. Whether or not he knew about the money going to Nicaragua, there was never any proof for that. We also have some terrorist acts starting to happen. So the U.S. relationship with the Middle East is falling apart, and we have things like the Marine barracks bombing in 1983. That's what these upper pictures are. So there was Marine barracks there. We weren't at war. It was just a U.S. military base. The barracks was bombed and hundreds died in that. This is called the Lockerbie bombing, or Pan Am bombing. Lockerbie is in Scotland. There was a bomb. The plane was bombed above Scotland. Everyone on board died. And again, it was targeted. These are Middle Eastern terrorist groups targeting Western groups. And so this really is going to start showing in the 80s that there's some unrest in the Middle East and some problems between the U.S. and the Middle East. So in 1988, Reagan has dealt with all of these things, and he can no longer be president. He served 2 terms. So who's up next? George H.W. Bush, or George Bush Sr. He was Reagan's vice president. In 1988, he runs and wins the election. So he will be our next set of